American culture and the other. In the first video, we looked at the relationship between American culture and Native Americans from the period of about 1880 up until the end of World War II. And so what we're looking at here is immigrants. Now, this is a whole lot of review for what we've done in class. And so I'm going to go through it a little quicker. Just want to make sure that we know kind of the end of the story. And I thought it'd be good to include this in our framework of how basically white Protestant Christian Americans treated people who didn't look, think, act, dress, or speak like them. So this is about as good a graph as I could find that breaks down the different groups that are coming to the United States during these different decades from 1870 to 1920. 1920 is significant because after World War I, we have a huge move into the conservative realm. And we covered that in class with the victory of the Republican Party. And one of their main platforms, this was not debated that much from the Democratic side. It was a pretty national idea, was to end immigration, or at least severely limit immigration. And a lot of that is wrapped up in the idea that these people are not like us. So we have the first bar is always our old Europe, our northwestern. It does include Ireland there. You can't see it because my picture's in the way, but that was the only one that was really different. We covered a lot of the context where Irish people weren't liked because they were poor and because they were Catholic. By the time we get into the 1870s, 1880s, Irish have pretty much assimilated into American culture despite their Catholicism. And while they're still kind of looked down upon, as these new groups come in, what we have is a kind of a common theme where people who are at the bottom of these social ladders are going to kind of turn on each other. And so the Irish, they're going to join in the nativism against the what's called the new immigrants. And you see right here, new. These are called the new immigrants, right? And so when we see here in this area here, this chart includes Germany and the Central European, but it's really important that we realize that most of mainstream Germans have been coming to the United States since the 1930s, and as you remember, they were the most accepted. The ones that are going to start coming in the 1880s, here in this bar and that bar, they're going to represent kind of more fringe Germans. This is going to be after the 1848 revolutions and kind of the onset of more radicalism within Germany. They're going to get pushed out. Those of us that took European history will remember that in 1870, the German Empire consolidated under Otto von Bismarck, and he had really two goals. One was to limit the influence of radicalism, and number two, to find common enemies. And one of the common enemies, he carried out something called the Kulturkampf, which is German for culture war, and it was against Catholicism. And so these groups that we have leaving are generally either going to be radicals or they're going to be Catholics. And they're typically, especially the radical ones, are typically going to be underclass, lower classes. Whereas if you remember previous, during the old section, the Germans were generally middle class farmers. But all of these groups are going to represent other people, right? They're going to be in Russia. Almost all these Russians that are going to come are going to be Jews that are as a result of the pogroms that are carried out by the Russian Empire against Jews in kind of their fringe areas, pushing them out. The Italians that are going to come, this is after Italian unity. And so we also have a lot of Italian radicals that are going to come over. Of course, the Italians are 90% Catholic and are they're going through a huge kind of early depression in Italy. They're going to be mostly male, and they're coming over for that. Here we have pictures from, let me move my face, pictures from Ellis Island. This is where all of this is. It's right next to the Statue of Liberty. Here's New York City as the immigrants are kind of looking out. And Ellis Island was where the European immigrants are going to come in. You had Angel Island off of the coast of California, which is where your Asian immigrants are coming in. And so Ellis Island is where they're going to come in. They're going to be inspected for health. And if they show any kind of health issue, they're going to be detained there. There's very few deportations. But it was not, it was kind of like a prison, a refugee camp. Most people just passed on through because they weren't going to send these people home, but they did detain a lot of them. And here they're looking for contagious eye disease. We cannot forget that during this time we had non-European immigration to the United States as well. These are Chinese laborers on the railroad. This is something we've already covered. But what we didn't cover too much was the beginning of what's called exclusion. And so over here, I got a political cartoon, the Chinese Must Go, the Working Men's Party of California. This was a political party that was organized to stop the Chinese from coming in. This is not because the Chinese were larger numbers than any of the European groups. Of course, they were in California, but not nationwide. It was really a what we call xenophobia. And what that is fear of the other. The Chinese represented, people who were not white, were not European, were not even Christians. They would be Buddhists. These particular Chinese workers here seem to have adopted a lot of Western American style clothing, but a lot of them didn't. A lot of them still kept their traditional hairstyles and things like that. And one thing about the Chinese government at the time is that the Chinese government said that any ethnic Chinese person anywhere was a subject of the Chinese emperor. And so a lot of Americans used that to say these people could never have complete loyalty to the United States because even if they don't want to be, they are, they belong to the Chinese government, the Chinese land. So they can never be true Americans. Of course, we'll remember our looks at the economy during the 1880s, and there was just constant up and down, up and down, up and down. And so anytime there's any kind of conflict or competition for jobs, they're going to pick this small minority group that's going to get picked on. And so this starts as a California movement, but it very quickly becomes national. And in 1882, they passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which bars Chinese and some other Asian migration for several decades. Chinese people are still going to be able to come in through issues like the 14th Amendment that says if you're born here, you're a citizen. There's this whole thing where they would forge papers and say, "Oh, that's my son." It was called a paper son. On paper, he's your son, but he wasn't really. It was a way they would sneak people in. They would also sneak in through Mexico. But Chinese immigration is going to be severely limited. This is all, of course, because of that big word, nativism. I said that over and over in class. A lot of times I was always like the N word, and everybody looked at me weird. And I was like, no, not that N word. And a lot of you always came up with nationalism, but nativism is the anti-immigrant sentiments. And I think this cartoon, more than just about any other, really encapsulates this idea, because even back then, if we went back in time, Americans would recognize, yeah, we are the children of immigrants, but they would always say these immigrants are different. And very few of them would have come right out and said they're darker than we are. But it was this idea that these were the lesser groups of Europe and North America and Asia. Even as you move kind of, eastward and southward in Europe, you have a darkening of the skin. And these are the groups that are coming. Your Hungarians, Italians, Yugoslavians. That would be Serbians, some of them even being Muslims. And so, and you can actually see in this cartoon the words that are put on here. Pauper. These are poor people that are lazy. outlaw, they're criminals, mafia. There, that was the big stereotype for Italians, that they were all in the mafia. Anarchist on this guy, illiterate. So these people cannot learn, they cannot assimilate because there's something bad about them as people. All right, all this kind of comes to a head with World War I. World War I, of course, the Germans now become the enemies. The Germans had it pretty easy as immigrants throughout the last 100 years, but now we start to have this new terminology of the Hun. That was like the barbarian, like Attila the Hun, and that was the way to say that a German is this kind of barbarian. He's gonna hit you on the head with his culture. You see the German word for culture on the "Destroy this mad brute." I should have found this, but maybe I'll put it in the next one. But this symbolism here it does not originate here with this poster, and this predates King Kong, by the way. And this was reserved for African Americans as being subhuman. A brute is a subhuman, can't control his emotions, can't control his sexuality. And so here, the message is very clear. Here they are. The Germans are coming to our shores. Unless you enlist in the U.S. Army, they're going to come and, ultimately they're going to take our women. And here they are. They're climbing in through the window. Here's Beat Back the Hun with Liberty Bonds. All of this is telling you how you can get involved to stop this. And remember that this is a really, really short period of time that this anti-Germanness takes over America, because we were only involved in the war for, 9 months. And prior to that, America was very divided. But once the war kicks up, even your second, third generation German immigrants in the United States, they go through what's kind of sometimes called hyper patriotism, where they're like, oh no, I'm an American. They all join the war to fight. And then we have the stuff that we kind of laugh at, like they changed the name of dachshunds, wiener dogs, they changed them to called Liberty pups, and they changed cabbage to Liberty. Sauerkraut turns to Liberty cabbage. It's all really kind of silly. Actually, that's where hot dogs come from. Before World War I, everybody called a hot dog a Frankfurter. Frankfurt is a city in Germany. And so they changed the name to hot dog, and that one stuck. Liberty cabbage didn't stick. And also all wrapped up in this was, what did the Germans make? Well, they made beer. And so they're going to ration wheat as part of the rationing that goes through in World War I. And the prohibitionists just go crazy, because this is like, look, this is another reason why we can say, let's get rid of alcohol, because it's this German tool. Previously, they were also connecting it to Catholics, and even with Germans, even German Protestants tended to drink on Sundays. And oh my God. So we got to get rid of alcohol. And so it's not an accident that prohibition passes right after World War I. All right. This was the real deal, though. Here, during World War I, you'll remember that the Russian Revolution happens. Communists take over Russia. Right after World War I ends, some of American troops, along with it's kind of an international coalition, go to try to disrupt the Russian Revolution, to fight in the Russian Civil War against the Bolsheviks, the Red Army. They're the ones that ultimately win under Vladimir Lenin. And so very quickly, all that anger, all that hype from the war, it shifts very quickly to these radical ideas. And we got to keep these out of America. And of course, this was something that's been brewing in America for a long time, with anti-labor union movements that we talked about in class. And so with radicalism, you got kind of your three big ideas here. You've got socialism of any kind. Remember, most European countries are going to adopt parts of socialism when the Great Depression hits. Almost all European countries are going to become democratic socialist to some extent. But it was really this radical versions of socialism, especially what we call now communism or Bolshevism. You'll see that. You can actually see it on that guy's knife right there. Sometimes it's also called Marxism or Leninism. And if you get into a political science class, there's, very, very kind of split differences between all those isms, but they're essentially all originated from the ideas of Karl Marx, which of course, if you don't remember from your world history classes, Marx said all history is a class war, the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. That's the working classes versus the owners or the middle classes. And he predicted, and he said that there's going to be a violent revolution. Basically, the underclasses won't take this oppression. And then Lenin came along and interpreted that to say that he has to start a revolution, which he did. And it was successful. All throughout that, you also had the anarchists, which were the kind of extreme versions that said this oppression is it's the government that's doing it. The government is a tool of the oppressors, and so government itself has to go away. And so, at the very end of the war, you have the one instance where this all comes together, where you have a German national that lives in the middle of nowhere in Illinois, who's also a communist, who's lynched for his ethnicity and his beliefs. It kind of represents that shift right there at the end of the war towards this anti-radicalism. And so here you can see that 1919 is the date on this real famous political cartoon here, that anarchy and Bolshevism is sneaking in. They always would draw the anarchists with the big messy beards. He's got his little Russian army hat there. And so over here, this is kind of like a farther extension of that, what had been brewing, that there are these types of immigrants that are bad. And that how do we know if it's a bad immigrant or a good immigrant? Well, it must be where they're from. This is kind of social Darwinist, kind of gone to an extreme. And here you've got Uncle Sam looking at the melting pot, which is usually, that's what America's supposed to be, where all these people come in and we all mix together and everybody's happy. But he says we can't digest the scum. And so he's kind of pouring out, and you can't read those words, but it's all your buzzwords. Bolshevism right there. IWW is the Industrial Workers of the World, which was a communist union that was pretty big in the United States, and it was trying to become a global union. And so this kind of rhetoric, remember, Americans are still in this war frenzy. The Republicans have won. They're conservatives. And that's going to lead towards the kind of culmination in 1924 when they passed the immigration law. That it's got a lot of different. There's actually a number of laws all passed together, and so you remember the year 1924, and you're good. There's a quota law. There's the National Origins Act. Sometimes it's called the Immigration Act. Sometimes it's called the Johnson-Reed Act. So there's a lot of different names for it, but it all happens in 24. And the basic gist of what comes down is that based on the 1890 census, which is purposeful, 1890 is before the Italians start coming over. And in fact, the first law was 1900, then they rolled it back to 1890 to cut out more Italians. You have the law says that whatever the percent of the population was for that ethnic group. So if population of Italy or Italian Americans based on the 1890 census was 3%, then out of the 200,000, they're going to be allowed, or however many thousand, I can't remember the number off the top of my head, however many are allowed in total immigrants, 3% of them can be from Italy. And it drastically cuts down those groups. If we flip back here, you see that all of these Eastern and Southern European groups jump before 1890. I'm sorry, after 1890, and the old immigrants actually drop down, right? And so if we saw in 1930, we would see that really immigration drops. The people from the old world, these groups over here, they're not moving over here anymore. Their development levels have increased, their populations have gone down, and they have less incentive to come over. Other than you have your first jump after the war, but after that we have less and less of those groups coming over. Of course, the Depression stops migration flows no matter what. One important factor that needs to be brought up with this law, though, is that it purposefully leaves out Western Hemisphere immigration. And the reason for this was because the southwestern United States was 100% dependent on cheap Mexican labor. It was moving in a cyclical fashion across the border, starting, probably in the early 1800s. We had Mexican workers that live in Mexico, but would move temporarily during the growing seasons to work, and then they would move back. And that was all allowed, and it was an established pattern, and they weren't going to try to break that by this law. One other thing that we got to talk about that happens in the 1920s, right after the war, is what's called the first Red Scare, and this kind of goes back to this, but it has a big influence on the passage of that law, where essentially you had Woodrow Wilson's Attorney General, a guy named A. Mitchell Palmer. He took it upon himself to rid the United States of people that were part of radical groups. And how do you know if they're part of radical groups? Well, you can't just get rid of an American citizen. The Constitution, the Supreme Court has ruled that you can't strip a person of their citizenship. But so they pass a series of restrictions that allows the Attorney General to deport immigrants who are suspected even of being radicals, oftentimes without trial. And so this comes down on a lot of Russian Jewish immigrants. There's a famous poet named Emma Goldman who actually read some of her stuff in class, and she is deported back to Russia, even though she was born there, and then moved over when she was a little girl, and had no connections there, and so they just throw her over there, even though she was not convicted of any crimes. Now, we have to, if you remember, we talked about the Homestead strike. Andrew Carnegie's right-hand man, Henry Clay Frick, had an assassination attempt on him, and Emma Goldman was actually involved in that. In fact, she was present when it happened, but it was her boyfriend who carried it out. But she wasn't convicted of a crime, and there were hundreds, thousands of immigrants that were kind of a victim to this. Another big incident that happens, and I should have had a picture of this, was something called the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. I had two Italian immigrants in New York that were they were anarchists, and they were part of an anarchist group. But there was a murder that happens, and they were arrested simply because they lived in the area, and they were radicals. They didn't speak very much English, and they were put on trial. They couldn't speak up in their own defense, and even though there was no evidence to tie them to the murder, they were tried and found guilty and executed for the crime, even though they had nothing to do with it. It was really just a trial of guilty by association, and that should remind you of the Haymarket affair. Remember that the test that you're going to take is a DBQ that's going to cover a big area, and so I could see a question about radicalism or even immigration, and you can connect the Haymarket trial or the Haymarket affair that was in the 1880s all the way up to into the 1920s with the Sacco Vanzetti trial, and to show that there's continuity there. Now then, so during the Depression, all around you have less migration, right? But once World War II kicks in, once production, which happens even before the United States actually joins the war, production levels increase, and so you have a need for workers. A lot of agricultural workers are going to make more in a factory, and so if we open up all these factories to make guns and bombs and jeeps and all these things, we're going to lose agricultural workers. And so the United States passed a law in the late 30s, early 40s, called the Bracero program. And what that did was it was basically a recruitment for Latin American migrant workers to come in to work, and they're going to be agricultural work. Although some of them are going to move up kind of established migration routes that happened since the Great Migration that we'll talk about next time with African Americans moving from the South up into a lot of northern cities, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, those kinds of areas. But these people were never brought in. It's much more like a guest worker program like you see in Europe after World War II than what we think of as migration. These people were brought in kind of, legalizing what we had talked about before, where you had this cyclic migration, seasonal migration. But they were not treated as citizens, second class citizens, maybe even like livestock. Here they are just getting like sprayed down with like pesticide stuff to kill, to disinfect them as they cross through the border. And it's demeaning. And so they were treated very, very much like second class citizens and not even citizens. But a lot of them actually stayed and kind of set down roots in especially Southern California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, these kinds of places. And eventually, as you would guess, this leads to conflict. It really bubbles over in what's called the Zoot Suit riots that happen in Southern California. This was called a Zoot Suit. It was a style of dress that was popular among Latin American and some African American, kind of the jazz scene. You have the big oversized brimmed hats, long coats. The whole thing kind of tapers into a point. Pants, your coat, everything tapers. It was real popular. You can kind of see it here. These long chains. Sometimes they went all the way to the ground. And they have these jazz dance clubs, and you have a mixing of Latin American men and white women, and eventually, that kind of thing bubbles over. And what happens is a group of servicemen on leave from World War II, a lot of sailors, they took exception, and we have a couple days of rioting between U.S. soldiers and these Mexican migrants, some of them citizens, some of them resident aliens. They're all there legally because of the Bracero program, but it's this big, huge ordeal that kind of bubbles into violence. And of course, the newspapers, who's going to get the blame for it? Is it the World War II heroes, or is it the immigrants? And of course, this is going to lead to a very quick end to the Bracero program after the war dies down. And what you will see, of course, we don't have time to go into it, so I might as well just mention it, is when they actually changed the law. They changed the law so that these immigrants are now illegal as they continue on this cyclic program. The employers are never discouraged or even penalized for hiring the workers. It's all of a sudden all of these workers who have been doing the job they and their fathers have been doing and their mothers have been doing for almost a century are now criminals because they continue on these patterns, because they kept their job essentially. That happens with the changing of the immigration law in 1965. But that's beyond our scope. So these videos are all about gaming a test, so go ahead and game it. That's the end. And so I hope that you guys got something out of this, and see you next time when we talk about African Americans.